Here's an excerpt from a leading Zionist video channel in Israel. It's about a Jewish organization in Sweden that supports Israel as a Jewish state and at the same time pushes non-European immigration into Sweden and Europe. Listen closely to the words of this Jewish activist about the Jewish role in all of this.
There are people in Sweden who support Israel and have a deep sense of the injustice of the present situation. It's these people who give hope to those who still believe that things will get better here. One of them is Barbara Spector, a former American who made Aliyah and then 10 years ago, with the help of the government of Sweden, set up a non-denominational institute of Jewish learning with the Greek name of Paideia here in Stockholm. She believes the current wave of anti-Semitism in Sweden will pass and that Jews have an important role to play in a country undergoing profound change.
I think there's a resurgence of anti-Semitism because at this point in time, Europe has not yet learned how to be multicultural. And I think we're going to be part of the throes of that transformation, which must take place. Europe is not going to be the monolithic societies that they once were in the last century. Jews are going to be at the center of that. It's a huge transformation for Europe to make. They are now going into a multicultural mode, and Jews will be resented because of our leading role. Jews will be resented because of our leading role.
Now, this Zionist boasts that Jews are leading the efforts for mass immigration and multiculturalism in Europe. Well, the Zionists have already ethnically cleansed the Palestinians. Why not do the same thing to Europeans and Americans? Barbara Spector says Europeans resent the Jewish role in leading the ethnic cleansing of the European people. And you know, she's right. We resent the hell out of it. My question to her is, what the hell are you doing in Sweden anyway? If you love Israel so much, go to Israel and take your multicultural propaganda with you.
So, for the past couple of decades, the nation of Sweden, the small Scandinavian country, has taken in more refugees per capita than any place on Earth. In 2015, Sweden got more than 160,000 asylum applications, mainly from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. That accounts for nearly 2% of Sweden's entire population. So what's the effect of this been? Eva Flardingerbrook is a legal philosopher who's from Sweden, and we're happy to have her on for the first time tonight. Eva, thanks so much for coming on. So we don't often enough get to the result. So we know what Sweden did. What happened next?
Well, what happened next was a skyrocketing crime epidemic, I would almost say. I mean, just a week ago, we had a new report come out about lethal gun violence in Sweden. And it turns out that Sweden has gone from one of the safest countries in Europe to now the second most dangerous country in Europe when it comes to lethal gun violence in just a time period of 10 years. So the effects of mass migration and demographic change haven't been small, to say the least. And still, many people refuse to make this link. But I would have to say that anybody who at this point still refuses to make the link between migration and the rise that we're seeing in crime in Sweden either lives in an ivory tower or has an interest in trying to cover up the truth. Because we're not just talking about lethal gun violence here. I mean, we're talking about gang wars that are being fought out in the streets of Sweden, explosions, knife crime, and not to say the least, soaring numbers of rapes as well. So, yeah, like I said, the effects aren't small at all. But there are people who are very much willing to cover this up because obviously the social democratic government in Sweden, who is responsible for these detrimental effects, would clearly prefer to have the Swedish people not to know what the exact numbers are about and the link between crime and migration. So what they'll do is they'll say, for example, with this report about lethal gun violence, they won't even mention the word migration. They won't even mention cultural clashes or incompatibilities. They'll just say, oh, you know what, these people, the perpetrators that are committing these crimes, they come from socially disadvantaged areas. So basically, prime example of this neo-Marxist rhetoric that the government is pushing and that the media is pushing in order to cover up the truth.
So Sweden goes from one of the safest places in the world to the second most dangerous country in Europe after Kosovo, and the people who run the country pretend it's not happening. So I guess they don't care about the people who live in Sweden.
Well, I mean, that's the only conclusion that you can take from this. They care more about being in power, clearly. So that's exactly what's happening. This neo-Marxist rhetoric, basically, in Sweden, you can steal, kill, rape, and still, if you're a migrant, you can be the victim in all this. And the effects are terrible for people who are living in Sweden. And yeah, if the people of Sweden don't break through this politically correct climate, this suffocating politically correct climate, and they don't start calling a spade, then I'm afraid that nothing much will change at all. So that's basically the first step that Sweden needs to start taking now, and that's making the right diagnosis. I mean, you can't change what you don't acknowledge. So as long as people are too afraid to say, this obviously does have something to do with immigration. Sweden never used to have gang wars up until, well, this decade, for example. Then how is anything ever going to change? And that, I mean, without that, they won't get to the second step, which is obviously that Sweden needs a migration stop from people coming from these radically different cultures. So yeah, Sweden is so far behind in this debate that I'm very worried that if we don't turn this around now, then things will look really, really bad for Sweden and Europe as a whole.
Yeah, but they'll let you die before they admit it.
Today I'm going to tell you about cultural Marxism.
Our enemy is cultural Marxism.
Political correctness is cultural Marxism.
We won the Cold War with political and economic communism. We've lost the cultural war with cultural Marxism.
The thing is, it doesn't exist, at least not outside the fever dreams of far-right extremists and right-wing pundits and politicians. The main characters and Mr. Lin's alma mater.
The work of slaughter went quickly. In less than 5 minutes of screams, shrieks, and howls, it was all over. The floor ran deep with the bowels of cultural Marxism.
One thing is for sure, any politician or pundit who utters the words cultural Marxism has got nothing to say when it comes to the biggest issues of our day, which people actually care about and affect their everyday lives, from healthcare to climate change, economic inequality, and the housing crisis. Some conspiracy theories are relatively harmless. Cultural Marxism isn't.
There is no planet blah, 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 blah. This is not about some expensive, politically correct green act of bunny hugging or blah, blah, blah.